I had some people listen attentively when I talked about the methodology of liberation. It goes by many different names. They're all in reference to one and the exact same thing. Specifically, it's the dialectic methodology of disobjectification. It seemed like it's just a fancy words, possibly, because it's not the sort of normal English that we use on a daily basis. And people have been beating me over the head to talk about this methodology and how do you stick all of that into a nutshell, about 25 minutes. Can you make a video longer than 25 minutes? People start to roll their eyes or they start to fall asleep. But I mean, some of the greatest masters actually composed countless volumes talking about one and the same thing. So condensing it down into 25 minutes is not impossible because it's really, really simple. But people don't gear their minds to think that way, and they never have, no matter how intelligent they are or not, how many PhDs or how much education someone did or did not get. We first actually have to start off with the premise to even seek for same, and it cannot be sought for objectively since it is by definition the pure subject, not an object which is to be found. It's like, well, how do you find something that you can't find objectively? You know, we're looking for the subject. I mean, tattvamasi, as the ancient statement goes, meaning that thou art, but what are we talking about finding it if we can't find it objectively? And the ancient masters, all of them, Platonic and Indian. And by the way, there's a great article on this called Recollection, Indian and Platonic. And we're talking about metaphysical recollection, not conventional recollection, about what you ate for dinner yesterday. Oh, you know, where did I go yesterday? They actually engaged in a dialectic. We actually first had to start off with the premise, those who are interested in understanding and actually starting on that path, that there is something ab extra to the psychophysical. You know, you first must concede that, and of course conceding it is just a belief in your head, and that's not helpful to anybody on anything. 99% of the world's problems are idiotic belief systems, and different people are attacking different beliefs, and most of which, of course, are idiotic. You know, well, that's just crazy. You know, the other person gets mad and, you know, wars ensue, all sorts of horrible things. So I'm not talking about belief systems, but we first have to start off with the premise that I'm not going to waste my time looking for something, not literally, objectively looking for something, which by definition is pure subject. I'm not going to waste my time seeking after that which I don't believe exists. And of course, once again, there's that word belief. We have to fundamentally know that it is ab extra to that. And the masters, before they actually talk about the methodology, they had a long string of dialectic engagement, which kind of went like this. Is it not the case that the locus of liberation must be ab extra prior to psychophysicality? The ancient Pali, which has been a dead language now for over 2,000 years, say Rupanata, Vedanata, Sananata, Sankaranata, Vinyanata, forms, feelings, perceptions, impulses, existential consciousness. By the way, the ancient word for consciousness is extremely accurate. It's basically no different than ignorance. It is vi plus jnana, means the inversion or the reflection of gnosis or wisdom. And wisdom is just a crazy word for self-proximity. I've said this a million times again, and this is important to think about. Not to listen to, but to listen to and then yourself think about. Nobody has ever purified gold. And there's no such thing as an impure soul, because the soul, by definition, is that which is to be sought after, not objectively. Once again, you know, it is the basis for that which one truly is, obviously so, and that, of course, would be liberation. We're talking about actualization. What is potential, of course, is not actual. I've used the radio analogy endlessly. But there's another analogy. There's there's a pinhole light analogy and a self-referential light analogy and a transcendent light analogy. And that would be getting to like a battery which powers the light bulb itself, pinhole light, and then self-coherent light, which doesn't take upon itself anything. As everybody knows, I got a little red laser here. It doesn't matter what you shine this red laser on, you're still going to see the red dot. Yeah, white light takes upon itself attribution of any object that falls in line. White light on, you know, the red ink here in my hand, you know, you see red, blue, so on and so forth. That is a light that is not self-referential. It is not spatially coherent specifically, and I'm getting to the methodology here. I'm trying to be as quick as possible By the way, this is how we actually created holograms using mercury arc lamps before lasers existed. We have the light bulb here. Of course, we don't see prior to the light bulb, of course, is the battery which powers it. It's spatially incoherent. Then we have pinhole source light here, which is point source light, spatially coherent. And then we have a filter which filters out all erroneous light such that the light is of one frequency. It is self-referential. However, in this case, the light has illumination and it goes forth, just as laser light goes forth. You know, it is ab extra to its source. It doesn't stay in the battery. Ultimately, we're talking about making our way back to the battery and then taking the batteries out and dropping them in your hand. Fundamentally is a simple dialectic, and the dialectic used by the ancient masters in the methodology. Is it not the case that that which we seek after is prior to or antecedent to psychophysicality? Why, yes, dear Lord, it is. Is it not the case that we can't get there by employing the same tools which make up psychophysicality to achieve the same goal? Yes, that certainly makes sense. So they engaged in a dialectic. Before even talking about the methodology, we actually had to have not mental awareness, but acuity of vision, i.e. wisdom. Since we had some simplex, self-referential, self-proximity, such that we were able to at least see a pinhole of light through the keyhole of wisdom. I mean, we're ultimately talking about cracking the door open, which is very difficult for most people, since most people don't have a dialectic metaphysical methodology in their brains or in their being to think this way. And this is the reason why, before talking about the methodology, these masters worked their way back by engaging in a dialectic. Is it not the case that this is so? Yes, it is. Well, that being the case, is it not the case then that this must be so? Yes, it is. There we go. And then you work your way, and then you start. Only at that point do you start the methodology. And people get tripped up by not making initiatory allowances to understand that you can't think your way out of a thinking box. Of course, mentation and consciousness, mano kavinyana, of course in English there's no distinction. In the case of consciousness is the consubstantiality of matter and spirit, and that of course is what everybody thinks they are. Most people of course think they are in further mentation, you know, that reflection in the mirror. So we have different gradations of ignorance. Not only are we not the consciousness, in English is mind, unfortunately. And in Pali and Greek, these are different words, chitta and nous, which are ab extra to. It would be the light or the actual signal prior to reception by the radio. Ultimately, we are the signal, which is true, but we are the unmodulated signal, because once there's modulation, and that, of course, is any frequency. Before an ab extra to this radio, you know, I break this radio, the signal is still everywhere. Is that not the case? Not only are we not the signal, we're ab extra to, of course, the consciousness would be analogous to the broadcast as it's processed through the analog to digital converters of this radio. People can't get past the broadcast. They're using the broadcast to try to transcend the broadcast. Listen clearly and think about that one for a second. And you can't get there from here. Neither can you think your way, and I'm first engaging the dialectic before talking about the methodology here. I know. You can't get there from here. It's completely impossible. It's like, what's the methodology? Well, first we have to make statements, declarative statements, that engage the dialectic before one begins in the methodology. And once one has opened up the keyhole and once one has cracked the door open a little bit, you don't need to make those acknowledgments anymore, but it is necessary to understand that you cannot get there from here. There's no purification of the broadcast. The broadcast which comes out of the speaker. The broadcast is not the signal. It's the interpolation of the signal. It's perfectly analogous with consciousness. Mentation, the analog to digital converters, and the process that goes on there, you can't get there through mind and mentation. Every ancient metaphysics, once again engaging in the dialectic before talking about the methodology, says the same thing. Liberation is the complete removal of modulation. Modulation of what? Once again, totally prior to this radio and this antenna. In the case of the antenna for manifestation, of course, is water. The broadcast is modulated with a certain frequency. Not only that, it has upper and sideband. That's actually a little too deep. Don't need to go into upper sideband or lower sideband modulation. It's modulated. So not only are we not the radio, we're not the broadcast, we're not the antenna, we're not the speaker. Yeah? We are the signal, but the signal is also, too, incorrect because the signal is under modulation, and that's the reason why it's able to be trapped by this radio. Not that it's actually trapped, but since it is a sentient signal as manifest, it identifies with itself as the battery, and on the speaker, the broadcast, all the constituent components that make that up. So engaging in that initiatory insight, i.e. the dialectic of the methodology of liberation, and these are just words. Someone in the comments section says, "You're just words, you're just using words." So that lacking, psychic intervention between myself and yourself. Words are the means of communication. There's no such thing as a pure soul. The soul is forever pure. There's about $300 in this worth of gold in this rock. I think you could even see it, but this rock is only worth about 20 bucks. Gold is never purified and the soul is never purified, but it is brought into self-proximity. We have a great word which is quite accurate. What's the opposite of dilution? Of course, gold is diluted amongst this rock. When people say gold purification or purification of the soul, we're not being accurate, really. Conventionally we are, but what are we talking about? The removal of modulation. Every branch of Greek and Indian metaphysics says the methodology for liberation, which is absolute self-proximity, is the removal of that modulation. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Bhava nirodha nabandham, the subjugation of becoming. Bhava. Bhava is no different than saying modulation. Yoga, the goal of yoga, i.e. liberation. In other words, the fruit of yoga. Chitta vritti nirodha, the subjugation of nirodha. Chitta, i.e. the nous, sort of the spiritus sanctum. Modulation. Vritti. Vritti means perturbation or modulation. Isn't every signal on earth that's received by a radio under modulation? Isn't that how we get AM and FM and HF radio signals? The modulation of the soul. The modulation is no different than saying primordial agnosis. The uncaused cause, which of course is the premise for embodiment. So we're never purifying the soul and we're never purifying gold. I'm undiluting it and concentrating it by ore extraction, powdering it up, adding chemicals, so on and so forth. This is a $20 rock, but if I took the gold out of this, I got basically $300 maybe, probably more, of gold. So we know we're not purifying it, we're extracting it. We're extracting it from what and why was it diluted amongst it to begin with? In the case of who we are, ultimately who we are versus that thing in the mirror, is the removal of that primordial agnosis. Ordered consciousness is only pinhole light. Spatially coherent consciousness is self-referential, but it is not self-coherent that is calm, at rest. The other one, of course, is transcendental, and the other one calms the body. A lot of people say, I do meditation, it calms me down. It's like, yes, it is true, but that is no different than pinhole light here, which is spatially coherent, but it is not self-coherent. There's a lot of things you could do to calm and have a happier life. I didn't want to be happy and calm. It's like, well, that's good for you, but that's not wisdom, and that is certainly not liberation. And people talk about emptiness, which of course does not exist. X is empty of Y. Something is empty of something else. The methodology in ancient Greek is called epistrophe. As Plotinus called it, monos pros monon, hello there. Thinking in Pali and ancient Greek at the same time, sometimes there's a conflict. Monon, not monokavinyana, monos pros monon, flight of the one to the one, self-referential. This means to turn away from in epistrophe. Epistrophe is no different than saying anapanasati or vipassana. People say, I do Vipassana, or I do Anapanasati, and then talk about breath meditation. Well, there is no such thing. I've written an article, by the way, it's in the description below. There's no such thing as breath meditation. It is talking about the animating principle, which of course we have in-breath and out-breath, which of course keeps us alive. It is metaphysical metaphor to talk about the modulation, which keeps one embodied. You're supposed to be antecedent to that. In Greek, the word is meneme, meaning recollection. Isn't recollection to recollect something no different than to say to concentrate something? I'm recollecting the gold out of this host rock. Recollection. To draw it out before it was embedded and diluted amongst this black host rock. True metaphysics and the methodology is hyper-rational and is hyper-logical. It is not, Harry Potter magic. It is no hocus-pocus, New Age twaddle and nonsense. It is hyper-rational. We're not observing and meant to be observing the cycle, rather becoming the source or prior to the impulse, this sati or mnemi, or Platonic recollection. There's an article and a book on this too. It's called Recollection in Indian Platonic. Actually, that's an article by A.K. Kumaraswamy, but there's also too called a book on Platonic and Indian recollection. My friend actually wrote a book on this apophaticism. Her name is Deirdre Caribbean. It's called The Unknown God. It actually talks about the Periphesian and Platonic and also too Christian mystic recollection. But letting go, but what is letting go of what? What is the methodology that you do? I'm happy that some people have actually read between the lines of what I'm talking about and thought about it and said, well, I can't get there by thinking. I know that which I truly am, the transcendent principle, is antecedent to psychophysicality and antecedent to this breath. There's no such thing as breath meditation. It's talking about the cycles that keep one alive. Of course, life requires embodiment. Life is not merely water and chemicals. It is also, too, the spirit, the animating principle. We have the same word in ancient Egyptian, that's in ancient Pali, that's in ancient Sanskrit, that's also, too, in English. Atan, Atan in Pali, Atman in Sanskrit. In English, we have the same root, atmo, as in atmosphere or atmospheric. Not literal winds, of course, we use that in English, but the animating principle, the breath of light, breath of life, the spiritus sanctum. Since every form of true logical rational metaphysics says the exact same thing, the removal of modulation, have you asked yourself, using the dialectic, which is necessary before engaging in the methodology, what is the modulation that is to be negated and transcended? People don't ask themselves this question. Before engaging in it, it's like, what logically, so I don't waste time, would be the dialectic basis for liberation? I'm never purifying the soul, since the soul is inherently pure. Wouldn't I then, therefore, be extracting it from modulation of false identity? Yisokaya namisata, the most repeated phrase in ancient Pali, the body is not the soul, not that which I truly am, as in tattvamasi, excuse me, that thou art. You can't think your way out of a thinking box. You can't think your way there. When people actually engage in this apophatic methodology, this via negativa, is as if you are the gold. Of course, the animated, not life animation, but a different level of true animation, the spiritus sanctum, that which you truly are. You're able to work your way out of the host rock. Because this is wisdom. Wisdom is self-proximity. Self-proximity is concentration of something. Is that not the case? Isn't it the case that you would not want to identify with all the phenomena due to your primordial ignorance that causes you embodiment, like the white light on anything will take upon itself the attribute of that which it falls upon. White light on red, on blue, on green, etc., etc. You see that respective light. What is it about, people will say, well, it's coherent. We can say self-referential, but actually what defines a laser is that it's point source light. Wouldn't you want to be something that is self-referential, that no longer takes up attribution with anything it comes into contact with? Isn't self-proximity, self-coherency? This is where power becomes multiplicative. This is why a 5-watt laser is infinitely more dangerous and powerful, infinitely more multiplicative. Not additive, but multiplicative. We're not talking about 1 plus 1 plus 1, rather, 5 times 5 times 5, for example. Why a 5-watt laser, for example, is, you ever thought about that? I don't think most people do. Why is a 5-watt laser infinitely more dangerous and powerful than a 5-watt laser? Isn't a 5-watt laser not only point source light, but self-referential and self-coherent light? Because a laser is defined by the fact that it's point source light. Secondly, by the fact that it is coherent light radiation. But we're taking ourselves even prior to the laser, because people will actually get past the dream state. This would be stage 1 of jhana. And by the way, the methodology, we could say anapanasati, a smriti, or a recollection, and talk about Platonic recollection, mnemi. we're talking about something that is antecedent to the laser. We're actually talking about the battery itself. Like, well, ultimately you're talking about being the laser. No, because even the laser light propagates itself outside its source, and it has a frequency. All laser light, of course, has a frequency. We're talking about something that has no frequency, no modulation, and that would ultimately, of course, wouldn't that be the battery itself? But a perfect battery that's not lossy, like a battery, of course, will lose due to humidity in the air, so on and so forth, a certain amount of its charge over time, and then become, if it just sits there, become, completely empty of charge. Aren't we talking about pure energy itself, no modulation? Because energy itself is modulation. The actual light itself has a frequency. Now, it's point source light and it's coherent light, but it also has frequency, and it does spread itself forth. It is emanative from the laser. Of course, light's not an emission, it's a disturbance of the ether, which I've talked about endlessly, and that's, of course, a matter for another discussion. But everything is modulation. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha, bhava nirodha nabandham. The ending of modulation, bhava. Becoming is modulation, the ending of perturbation of self. Vritti, the subjugation of perturbation. Vritti nirodha. I'm engaging right now in discussion of the dialectic. You have to do that before you engage in that methodology. It is necessary because one is completely lost on the path. To even fundamentally acknowledge this must be true, this then therefore is true, when that is true, then this is true. Therefore the methodology is, it's hyper-rational and it's hyper-logical. Then can you ask yourself, what then is the question? Just like soul purification, because the soul is always pure, there's no purification. Just like gold extraction, gold purification, I'm purifying the gold. Technically, no, because gold is gold is gold. Is that not the case? We're extracting it from the host rock. Well, what would be the extraction of the soul from this radio body composed of water and consciousness? Because you are not the water, which is the antenna. You are not the battery, which of course is the food that we eat that gives us calories, that gives us, life to go about our daily business. We're certainly not the broadcast from the speaker. We're not the interpolation of that, which is the signal. Consciousness, by the way, once again, is the consubstantiality between matter and spirit. Matter, spirit, these two together are consciousness. People will work their way back to a dream state, a disembodied dream state, where the mind itself is suffocating in its own dream state. It will produce things that people will observe like a movie, just like you're watching yourself, either as yourself or outside of yourself in a dream state. The mind will build its own illusion if you work your way back that far. You have to work your way back even prior to that. Epistrophe, i.e. the path of liberation, is turning away from. But what is it that you're turning away from? People are afraid, and they don't think that they can turn away from everything that they think that they are, and also, too, that everybody else thinks that they are. There's Bob Sue, and he's 5'10", and he's 200 pounds, he's 45 years old. He thinks this way, he believes that way. You are none of those things. You can't be, by definition, any of those things, nor could you think yourself to be any of those things, and this is why engaging the dialectic as an initiatory, before even engaging in the methodology, is necessary. Well, none of those things are true. I'm not going to waste my time doing them. If Platonic recollection, smriti or sati or anamnesis, is the commandment for concentration away from phenomenality, I am not only not the antenna, not the radio, not the broadcast. I'm not even the signal. Smash this, throw it into a pit of fire, the radio's gone. I'm also, too, not the signal, because the signal is under modulation, and that's how the signal gets trapped. And that modulation of the signal is no different than primordial agnosis, or avidya, which is no different than saying consciousness. Consciousness is just a psychophysical version of avidya. It is absolutely awe-inspiring how hyperlogical and hyper-rational true metaphysics is, and also, too, the dialectic of engaging in the methodology is. So you first have to acknowledge those before beginning on the path of that methodology. It's like, well, this being the case, I acknowledge all these points. What, therefore, then, is sati, mineme, apophaticism, via negativa? Once you understand that you're none of those things, including not the signal, which is a frequency under its own modulation, because frequency implies modulation, and modulation, of course, implies frequencies. You're antecedent to all of those things. Monos pros monon, excuse me, my favorite passage from Plotinus, flight of the one to the one. The one to the one. Well, the one is always the one. How is it there is a flight of the one to the one, as Plotinus mentions in Ennead 5.4? The removal of modulation. Modulation equals volume, equals entrapment, equals temporalization, equals embodiment, and of course is resultant to primordial agnosis. You have to engage that dialectic before beginning on the path of the methodology. Doesn't matter what word you use for the methodology, vipassana, epistrophe, anapanasati, meneme, this via negativa of disobjectification. You have to realize you are none of the things that you think you are. And you've thought your way that entire life. And this is why it confuses the hell out of people. It's like, I have no idea how to even begin that. Well, that is how you begin. I will save another video for the actual methodology. I mean, you have to have acknowledgement of these points. Every ancient, I'm not talking myself as a master, but every ancient master has said that these are necessary before even beginning. And it saves time. You can waste a lifetime, headed down the wrong path. Anybody can, and countless people have through the millennia, obviously so. Try to keep it short and sweet. It's really hard to do that within like 20, 25 minutes, but I hope I've succeeded. I wanted to take a few minutes on to the end of this, because this is where we engage in a hyperbolic, cryptic, and it shouldn't be that way because it is hyper-rational, discussion of the methodology. And once again, you can't think your way there, but people have never had a moment of their life where they have been other than themselves. People say, well, sure I did. I took whatever, chemical that people say. I saw myself outside of myself. Those people have. And that is the poor man's way, not the wise man's way, and I don't care what people do. The poor man's way of, smashing the radio. They became the sentient but disembodied signal staring at the psychophysical radio that is Bob Sewer. It's like, man, oh man, I finally saw myself outside of myself. It's just, hopefully it's temporary. People have overdone it and they've permanently broken it, and poof, that's it. They're gone from this world. But temporarily broken the radio. And I know why people do it. I don't do it at all. I wish people would stop asking me about that. They must think that since I'm covered with tattoos that I do that stuff. I do not, I assure you. But I do know why they do it. They have a unific vision for however brief a period of time, where they are outside of themselves and they realize that they are not the meat suit. The signal, the radio is temporarily smashed or turned off, or they took the battery out, analogously, and they realize that they are not the meat suit. The word jhana means to burn. Okay, the methodology, I'll never use the word meditation because it's completely undefined. It is completely 100% aspecific. I will not use that word at all because it means nothing, and that's not my opinion. That's a fact. That word is completely undefined. The word in ancient Pali, and I don't care if it's Pali or Sanskrit or Greek or even English. English, there is no correct word, really. Actually, there is THEURGY, which comes from the Greek, of course. The word is jhana, which means to burn. Burning away objectivity. Okay. We first must acknowledge that we are not only no physical constituent of the radio, that would be, of course, gross matter, obviously, forms, feelings, and perceptions. That actually goes from gross to fine, and then fine to gross, as far as embodiment, and then, of course, disembodiment. You go from fine to gross matter, and then you work your way back from gross matter. Well, I know I'm not the body's just a meat suit, they burn that. Okay, I've thrown that log on the fire. Then you have to work your way back and back and back. You fundamentally must, by dialectic induction, yes, not dielectric, Dialectic induction. Comprehension is like, well, if I'm going to engage in this methodology of disobjectification, I have to realize that I am not matter, and I'm not even the finer constituents of same. I'm not the casing of this radio, I'm not the battery, I'm not the antenna, which in the case of life would be water. I'm not the analog to digital converter, and I'm not the broadcast. The broadcast is perfectly analogous to so I am none of those things. You burned away that from gross to fine. But there is still a finer component, and that they call this the third or the fourth level of jhana. Once again, jhana means to burn. But we're not talking about spiritual suicide here. We're talking about burning away gross to fine selfhood, and selfhood with a small s, because the ultimate goal, of course, is the large self, the actual transcendent soul, the actual gold here. It's never purified. It's extraction. But what's the extraction methodology? You know, interestingly enough, the same word for the methodology to burn, jayate, i.e. jhana, goes from jhana to from the Pali, and then of course that word actually became zen, chana, jhana. Anyway, no need for word etymology on that particular word. But this disobjectification methodology that you must extract yourself from. It's like, not only am I none of the constituents of the radio from gross to fine, I am also, too, not the signal. It's like, sure, we're the signal. Well, yes, you are, but you are the signal without modulation. What would a signal without modulation be? Wouldn't that just be pure energy? It would have no footprint. This is what the ancient Pali passages referred to. Said, it's not literally that there's an evil one. When Gautama died, the evil one went looking to and fro. All the coordinal compasses, coordinal vectors on the compass, nowhere to be found. Because there's no modulation. Anything without modulation, by definition, is pure energy. And it has no Cartesian value. It has no footprint in space and time. It is the rest inertia of pure potential. It is sentient pure potential, which does not partake of modulation. And anything that partakes of modulation must necessitatively, there's that word again, partake of embodiment. And when you have embodiment, you have suffering. The Four Noble Truths, by the way, is just an ancient Auto-Vedic doctor's motto. It was the recognition of suffering, then the cause of the suffering, and the third was the diagnosis, and the four was the application of the cure. Well, the application of the cure is Platonic recollection. Greek recollection is sati, smriti, anamnesis, anapanasati. This means antecedentness before breath. Because breath is the modulation that keeps the body alive, in breath and out. All these people throughout the past several thousand years have been doing breath meditation. Oh my God, I feel so much calmer when I do it. It's like, yes, you do, but that is not the goal. Well, how dare you say that? It's like, well, what you're doing is helpful. And you actually have a pinhole of light analogously of spirit, but you are not self-referential. It is not self-coherent where true liberation is effectuated. And one can be liberated and still alive, and this is what is referred to as the dead man walking. Someone who has died. There's an ancient commandment that says, die before ye die. In Italian, it's se ignoraste egredere. If know thyself not, be gone. In other words, you're a fool if you do not know thyself ultimately as transcendent to psychophysicality. So it is it's not apanasati or apana, which is breath, i.e. modulation of breath. It's recollection or maneme, before breath. In other words, you're aware of the modulations. You're not focusing on the modulations. You're made aware of the modulations. This is what the Anapanasati Sutta Majjhima Nikaya talks about. It does not make any reference to breath meditation. You're aware of the modulation that keeps this body alive, but you are antecedent to Anapanasati. Maneme before breath, recollection before modulation. Recollection before modulation. We've already negated the radio and all its finer components. Recollection before modulation, that means we've already put this down. Now we're actually putting down the modulation of that which one truly is, which is the removal of primordial agnosis. You know, the impetus for embodiment, which of course is avidya. Avidya is no different than saying illumination, by the way. And isn't it neat that illumination, by definition, is modulation? Illumination, of course, is a set frequency. It's the attribute of light. That thou art is a reference that you are light, not illumination. People are confused. You say light, people don't hear light and think light. They think illumination. I say light to you, you are never ever thinking about light. I assure you of that 100%. You are not thinking about light. When I say light, you are not thinking about light. You're thinking about illumination. You're thinking about modulation. XYZ frequency of light. You're never thinking about light. This is why it's so difficult. I could talk about light alone as far as why people don't get recollection or antecedentness to modulation of life. Modulation of life, the ancient metaphor is breath. Apama. It doesn't talk about breath anything in the Majjhima Nikaya or the Rig Veda or the Upanishads or whatever. It talks about antecedent prior to that modulation. What is antecedent to the signal? We got rid of the radio. Now we're talking about the signal. What is antecedent to the modulation? What is antecedent to the modulation is no longer a signal. It is energy. At the radio station, analogy-wise, is before one flips a switch that turns on the power that engages the modulation. Which of course the modulation, magnetism is modulation of the dielectric. Everything is completely tied. The methodology of liberation, light and illumination, the radio analogy, it's all hyper simple. Modulation is demonstrable. It leads to embodiment, which leads to suffering, leads to false identity. True Platonic recollection, true jhana, true anapanasati, true because vipassana is vipassasati. It's literally being antecedent to that which we falsely identify as. That is the methodology. Am I just using words? That's the means for communication. I'm not engaging in mental telepathy here with you. Unfortunately, words are necessary in audio-video presentations, even ones on methodology. So I hope I made that clearer. I tried to keep it really short and sweet. Can you hear the weed whacker going on out there? The neighbors using the weed whacker. Darn them, just kidding. See, that's causing modulation to me too. It's not actually angering me, but it would anger somebody else. There's all of these things, which are all perturbations, which anger us, disturb our lives, make our lives more painful and suffering and so forth. We're able to see through it and part the way, which most people can't do. And I fail at that sometimes. I certainly do. But all feelings are modulations, and they're all bricks in the Lego house of suffering and further embodiment. And people just can't see through it. And not only can they not see through it, they have no way around it. They have no way of even conceiving how to get around it. I hope I simplified this a little bit. But thanks.